the winter of 1954, deep in the heart of northern Ontario, in a town called Meadowpine, a strange and chilling incident unfolded. Meadowpine was one of those quiet, forgotten towns where life moved at the pace of the snowflakes that seemed to fall endlessly from October to March. But that winter, it was different. My name is Robert Liddell, and back then, I was just 19 years old. I worked at Miller's General Store, the only store in town that carried everything from canned soup to kerosene. It was the kind of place where everyone knew your name and your business, whether you wanted them to or not. The cold had come early that year. By late November, the snowbanks were already taller than a man, and the frost crept into everything, even the bones. People started saying it felt unnatural. Old Mrs. Patterson, who swore she could predict the weather better than any radio, said the air tasted wrong. "Something's brewing," she'd mutter, her cloudy eyes scanning the horizon. At first, it was small things, livestock found frozen in their stalls despite sturdy barns, windows cracking under the weight of the frost, and people complaining about hearing faint knocking sounds at night. Knocking, but there was no one there. I didn't think much of it until I experienced it myself. It was late December. The store had closed for the day, and I was walking home along Main Street. The streets were empty, the gas lamps casting long shadows across the snow. My boots crunched with every step, the only sound in the otherwise deafening silence. And then, I heard it. Knock, knock. It was faint, almost drowned out by the sound of the wind. I stopped in my tracks and looked around. Nothing. Just a cold, empty street and the snow swirling in the air. I told myself it was the wind playing tricks on me and hurried home. That night, I heard it again. Knock, knock. This time, it was louder, more distinct, and it was coming from my bedroom window. My room was on the second floor. No one could have been outside my window. My heart raced as I sat up in bed, staring at the frost-covered glass. The knock came again, and this time, I saw it, a handprint, clear as day, pressed against the outside of the glass. I bolted out of my room and down the stairs, shouting for my father. When we returned with his shotgun, the window was empty, the handprint gone. But the frost on the glass, it was melting, as if someone, or something, warm had been there just moments before. By mid-January, the whole town was on edge. People started staying indoors, locking their doors and windows at all hours. Meadowpine felt like a ghost town. The knocking wasn't confined to my house, others heard it too. Some said it followed them, moving from window to window, door to door, as if it were searching for a way in. And then, the disappearances began. The first to vanish was Tom Keller, the town's blacksmith. He'd gone out to check on his forge late one night and never came back. They found his boots the next morning, standing neatly side by side in the snow outside his shop. His footprints ended abruptly, as if he'd been lifted straight into the sky. More followed: Lucy Bennett, the schoolteacher, Charlie, the bartender at the Hollowed Oak, even Sheriff Duncan. Every time, the same story, no signs of a struggle, just footprints in the snow that led nowhere. By February, I was terrified to leave the house. The knocking became more frequent, more insistent. It wasn't just at night anymore. I'd hear it in broad daylight, sometimes at the store, sometimes while walking to the post office. One evening, I decided to confront it. It was around 10 p.m. The fire was burning low in the hearth, and my parents had already gone to bed. The knock came again, this time at the front door. Knock, knock. I grabbed a lantern and crept toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't open it right away. Instead, I peeked through the curtain. A man stood there, his face pale and his eyes wide with an unnatural brightness. His breath clouded in the icy air, but his expression didn't change. It was as if he wasn't really seeing me. "Who are you?" I shouted through the door. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Then, slowly, he raised his hand and pointed, not at me, but at something behind me. I turned, the blood draining from my face. The back door was wide open, snow blowing in across the floor. I don't remember much after that. My parents found me the next morning, curled up in the corner of the living room, the front door still locked, but the back door swinging on its hinges. The disappearances stopped after that night, but the snow didn't melt until late May. People said it was the coldest winter in living memory, but no one liked to talk about what really happened. I moved away from Meadowpine not long after, but every year, when the first snow falls, I hear it again. Knock knock. And every year, I wonder, what would have happened if I had opened that door? In the winter of 1976, I spent 2 weeks in a small, sun-baked village called San Alvarado, nestled in the heart of central Mexico. My father had been hired to oversee the restoration of an old hacienda on the outskirts of town, and since it was summer break, he brought me along. I was 17 at the time and restless, itching for adventure in a place where time seemed to stand still. San Alvarado was the kind of village where the streets were little more than dusty trails, and the air was heavy with the smell of mesquite and the faint sweetness of blooming jacarandas. There was no running water in most homes, and the villagers relied on a network of ancient wells for their supply. One well in particular, though, was avoided at all costs. They called it El Pozo de las Voces, the Well of Whispers. I first heard about it from a boy named Mateo, who was about my age. We had become fast friends during my stay, spending our afternoons exploring the surrounding hills. One day, as we sat beneath the shade of a crumbling stone wall, Mateo pointed toward a cluster of trees at the edge of the village. "That's where it is," he said, his voice low. "The Whispering Well." "Why is it called that?" I asked, intrigued. Mateo hesitated, his normally mischievous expression clouding over. "People say it speaks to you," he said finally. "But you shouldn't listen. If you do, bad things happen." I laughed it off as a local ghost story meant to scare children, but Mateo was deadly serious. He told me about a woman named Dona Clara, who had gone to the well late one night and returned home screaming about voices calling her name. She had locked herself in her room and refused to come out. When her family finally broke down the door, they found her dead, her face twisted in terror. Despite Mateo's warnings, I couldn't shake my curiosity. Something about the well drew me in, like an itch I couldn't scratch. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned a deep orange, I decided to see it for myself. Mateo refused to come with me, so I went alone, a flashlight in one hand and my heart pounding in my chest. The trees surrounding the well were ancient, their gnarled branches twisting together to form a canopy that blocked out the last light of day. The well itself was made of weathered stones, its surface slick with moss. A heavy wooden cover lay over the top, secured with a rusty chain. I stood there for a moment, feeling foolish. It was just a well, after all. But as I turned to leave, I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. "Hola." I froze. The sound hadn't come from behind me or the surrounding trees. It had come from beneath the wooden cover. "Quien está ahí?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I found myself reaching for the chain. It took all my strength to slide the cover aside, and when I did, I saw nothing but darkness. The air that rose from the well was cold, much colder than it should have been on a summer evening, and it carried a strange, metallic scent. And then, I heard it again. Ven, Venetia. The voice was clearer this time, soft and melodic, like a woman's. My flashlight beam pierced the darkness, illuminating the slick stone walls, but there was nothing there. The voice grew louder, more insistent, and I realized it wasn't just one voice, it was many, overlapping in a cacophony of whispers. I stepped back, my legs trembling, but before I could run, something cold brushed against my ankle. I screamed and stumbled, dropping the flashlight. In the chaos, I heard laughter, soft, cruel laughter that echoed from the depths of the well. I don't remember how I made it back to the hacienda, but when I burst through the door, my father knew something was wrong. I tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come. All I could do was point in the direction of the well. The next morning, Mateo came to find me. His face was pale, and his hands shook as he held out my flashlight. "You left this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Did you go there?" I asked, dread pooling in my stomach. Mateo nodded. "I heard them too," he said. "But they weren't calling for you. They were calling for me." That was the last time I saw Mateo. 2 days later, he disappeared. The villagers said he must have run away, but I knew better. I went back to the well once, years later, but the trees had overgrown, and the path was almost impossible to find. Still, sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear it. Venetia. And I wonder, if I hadn't listened that night, would Mateo still be here? In December of 1992, a brutal winter storm swept through Clearwood, a small town in Montana nestled deep in the Rocky Mountains. I was 22 at the time and living alone in a cabin just outside town. Clearwood wasn't much, a handful of stores, a diner, and a population of just over 500. Winters there were always harsh, but that year was something else. By mid-December, the snowdrifts were already waist-deep, and temperatures had plunged to record lows. The storm started on a Sunday night. The wind howled like a living thing, shaking the walls of my cabin, and the snow fell so thick it seemed the world had vanished beyond my frosted windows. I was huddled near the fireplace, a mug of coffee in hand, when I saw it, a shadow moving through the blizzard. At first, I thought it was a trick of the firelight, but then the shadow moved closer, resolving into the unmistakable shape of a man. He was stumbling, swaying as if every step might be his last. I grabbed my coat and boots and rushed outside, the freezing air cutting through me like knives. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice nearly lost in the wind. "Do you need help?" The man didn't respond, but he collapsed into the snow just a few yards from my porch. I reached him in seconds. His face was pale, his lips blue, and his clothes were soaked through. I managed to drag him inside, where the fire's warmth began to melt the frost clinging to his skin. "Are you okay?" I asked, shaking his shoulder gently. His eyes fluttered open, and he stared at me with a wild, almost feral look. "They're coming," he whispered, his voice hoarse and barely audible. "Who's coming?" I asked, but he didn't answer. He passed out moments later. I should have driven him into town right then, but the storm was too fierce. The roads were impassable, and my old truck wouldn't have made it a mile. So I did what I could, wrapped him in blankets, fed him soup when he came to, and tried to get answers. But every time I asked who he was or what had happened, he just shook his head and muttered about them. By the second night, I began to notice odd things. The first was the footprints. I had gone outside to fetch more firewood and saw tracks in the snow, dozens of them, surrounding the cabin. They were small, like a child's, but barefoot. No one could survive out there without shoes, not in that cold. The second was the sounds. At first, It was faint, soft scratching at the windows, like tree branches in the wind. But as the hours passed, it grew louder, more insistent. By midnight, it sounded like dozens of hands clawing at the walls. "They've found me," the man whispered from the couch, his eyes wide with terror. "You have to let me go. They'll leave you alone if I'm gone." "Who are they?" I demanded, but he just shook his head again. Around 3 a.m., the power went out. The cabin plunged into darkness, save for the flickering firelight. That's when I heard the voices. They were faint at first, like whispers carried on the wind. But soon, they grew clearer, high-pitched and childlike, but wrong, like a recording played backward. "Come out," they sang, their voices lilting in eerie harmony. "It's cold out here. We just want to play." I grabbed my shotgun and moved to the window. Outside, the snow had stopped falling, and the moon illuminated the yard in an otherworldly glow. That's when I saw them, figures, small and pale, with wide, black eyes and mouths that stretched too far across their faces. They stood in a circle around the cabin, their heads tilted at unnatural angles, watching. My breath caught in my throat. I turned back to the man, who was now sitting up, his face pale and drenched in sweat. "What are they?" I demanded. "They followed me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're not human. They come from the cold. They feed on fear." I didn't have time to question him. The scratching at the walls started again, more violent this time, as if they were trying to claw their way inside. The windows began to rattle, frost spreading across the glass in intricate, spiderweb patterns. The man stood suddenly, his movements jerky and unnatural. "I have to go," he said. "It's the only way to stop them." Before I could stop him, he threw open the door and stepped into the snow. I screamed for him to come back, but he didn't even look at me. The creatures swarmed him, their movements unnaturally fast. He didn't fight, he just stood there, arms outstretched, as they closed in. And then, they were gone. The man, the creatures, all of it, gone, as if they had never been there. The snow was untouched, no sign of struggle, no footprints where they had stood. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. When the storm finally cleared, I drove into town and told the sheriff everything. He chalked it up to cabin fever and an overactive imagination, but I know what I saw. I moved out of Clearwood that spring, but I still have nightmares. Sometimes, when the wind howls just right, I hear them again, those high-pitched voices, whispering from the cold. "Come out," they say. "We just want to play."